Welcome to The Hill's Coronavirus Report. I'm Steve Clemons, editor-at-large of The Hill. Each day we are interviewing consequential leaders and innovators in the battle against the coronavirus. One of the least understood arts in achieving substantive policy or political goals is that of project management. It may sound boring, but it's important. In fact, Michael Lewis, in a book a couple of years back, talked to a number of people in civil service roles in government about what they thought the biggest risks facing the Trump administration and the nation would be as the transition between Obama and Trump took place. One of his subjects identified his fifth risk, which became the title of Michael Lewis's book, as project management. In fighting COVID-19, the federal government knew that it would need ventilators and respirators and other PPE materials and equipment distributed to hospitals nationwide. It had early warning. And yet what we saw unfold is that states and hospitals had to compete with one another for this equipment and ran the risk that federal authorities would actually poach what they had secured and hijack it for their own uses. We saw the FDA and the CDC move in different directions when it came to establishing the standards for a coronavirus test. Then manufacturing and distributing that test became a big problem. And then managing the test results in a sensible way. Remember when a test result, either from a symptomatic or an asymptomatic person, took more than 10 days to get? I remember Senator Rand Paul, who ended up with a positive test, working out in the Senate gym and not wearing a mask or social distancing while he was waiting for his test. This is all troubling to say the least. There were intelligence warnings in December. The CDC called its first sit-room meeting in the White House around January 2nd. Flights from China were not stopped until much later. Remember Lysol Day, when the president suggested that maybe a little disinfectant or perhaps an internal UAE light might just clean up everyone to be spiffy and perfect again. What we see is a problem in decision-making, in information management, in logistics, and the management of complex systems that need oversight. My next guest has been referred to by at least two vice presidents, both Al Gore and Joe Biden, as the person who understands government and how it works and thinks and moves and bends better than anyone. When President Obama's team was engaged in its own morass of Keystone Cops behavior when the Ebola crisis in Africa threatened to possibly expand dramatically, it was Ron Klain who was asked to put his day job on hold and to become the Ebola czar, coordinating America's and much of the world's response to Ebola then. Klain is former chief of staff to Vice Presidents Biden and Gore, and he is EVP and general counsel at Revolution, and he has a high-octane podcast on all things SARS-CoV-2 related called Epidemic that I listen to and that you can find at Apple Podcasts. Ron, thanks so much for joining me today. Sorry for that long-winded introduction, but I wanted to put a big punctuation point around project management and around decision-making and this stuff that sounds boring to everyone but is so vital whether you're in a Democratic administration or a Republican administration in responding to a crisis. And I'd love to kind of get in your head for a minute about what we're not doing today that you put to place when we were dealing with Ebola.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Steve. Appreciate that. Look, doctors, nurses, scientists beat diseases, but policy and planning and public health beat pandemics. Fighting a pandemic is a giant logistical challenge, and we've seen the failure of kind of the Trump administration's management of that over the last 4 months. First, ignoring and denying the threat, refusing to centralize management of it in the White House, kind of leaving it at HHS, and then, having a series of chaotic structures in the White House. All these things have led to the problems you talked about in your introduction. The fact that we lagged most of the world on testing when we could have tested earlier, like Korea did, the fact that we lagged most of the world on getting our hospitals ready to go, the fact that we've lagged the world on social distancing measures, all these things are the product of inconsistent and erratic coordination out of the White House, a lot of politics instead of scientific guidance to the process, and just generally a kind of bungled response.
When you look at the situation today and you were to kind of look at it zero base, where we at the moment, where do you think the government is performing well and where is it not?
Well, I think it sounds like there's a good effort underway to really accelerate the vaccine. And, I have a lot of confidence in that because Dr. Fauci, he's the head of the National Institutes of Allergies and Infectious Disease. He's really overseeing that project in a very direct way.
And you worked with, not to interrupt, but you worked with him in Ebola, right?
I did, every day.
Yeah.
Tony and I talked every day. He's a great national treasure. He served 6 presidents. He's never had a problem with the president until now. He was highly trusted by Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama, George Bush and Bill Clinton. I mean, the idea that Donald Trump somehow tries to sideline him is just ridiculous. Likewise, Dr. Nancy Messonnier, who is the deputy director at CDC in charge of respiratory illnesses. That's what we're dealing with here. She's also largely been kind of tried to be pushed out of the picture by the Trumpers because of her early warnings about the risk of this pandemic. But she's also, I know, playing a critical role behind the scenes on this vaccine. So I think progress on the vaccine seems like it's moving along very well. I think President Trump maybe has been over-optimistic in his public statements about it, hyping it as always, but I think it's coming along. Look, I think on the fundamentals of the public health response, we're still way behind where we need to be. Still too hard, too difficult, and too rare for people to get tests. We don't have a regular system of testing people before they go back to work or testing your colleagues or whatever. We don't really have contact tracing up in most parts of the country. So even if we test someone, we're really not following up outside of a few places aggressively on figuring out who that person was in contact with. That's what isolates chains of transmissions. That's what snuffs out epidemics. We're not really doing a good job of telling people how to reopen safely, what kind of gear workers need to wear, what kind of rules and procedures. We kind of basically left everyone on their own. I mean, it is the most, kind of laggard, disjointed response you can imagine. I think when I talk to people in business leaders, a lot of them say basically, I'll kind of do whatever I can to make my workers safe, or I'll do whatever I can to make my business safe, but I just don't really know who's in charge and who's telling me what I should do.
I'm wondering whether this kind of Darwinian system of states and companies and everyone just working out gets us to a better place in the end, or whether it's a very dangerous one. On contact tracing, talked to a CEO recently of a company called Citizen, and maybe it has a good system, or maybe it's dangerous because of privacy. I don't know. In Singapore, they're deploying wearables to try to help them instantly identify where people have been, to try to talk to them about, to remind people where they've been. And you can either believe the government or not believe the government over there, but people are bringing technology on because they're taking this as a much higher issue. Lots of people have already begun to reject that in the United States because of privacy concerns. How do you get the equilibrium right between, tech solutions that may help us beat this thing and those that say, hey, we're going to create a new sort of surveillance that we need to be cautious of?
Well, let's be clear. I think technology does have a role to play here, Steve, but contact tracing requires contact tracers. The data is only useful if there's someone who's analyzing the data and really turning it into kind of a real pattern of what we see. And so I think our biggest gap right now is a real lack of contact tracers. Vice President Biden, who I support, as you mentioned at the outset, announced yesterday a 8-point plan for how to reopen safely. And one of the biggest elements there was a proposal to create a contact tracing corps of 100,000 people. We need jobs in this country anyway. We create good paying jobs of people manning contact tracing, of people really tracking it down. I think on these technology issues, again, I think tech can be helpful. I do think privacy issues are very, very important. I think people have to, all this technology has to be consented to. I think in America, people should have the right to accept or reject use of these tools. But ultimately, when even if you consent, Steve, and it says that your iPhone was near my iPhone, we need human contact tracers to understand what kind of contact we had. Do I need to be isolated? Do you need to be isolated? And that's really the thing we're lacking. Public health isn't, advanced technology. It's a lot of well-proven, established techniques. I think that's the craziest thing about this conversation we're having as a country right now about masks, for example. A lot of resistance, a lot of upset, a lot of anxiety about the mask thing. But there's just data after data after data that shows it's a simple, effective way to slow transmission of the disease. And so I think if we went to more mask wearing, we went to better testing, more contact tracing, we would bend this curve of the disease downward more quickly.
One of the things that's come out of these many interviews that I've done in the last couple of months is that lots of people saw this coming. In fact, many worry, whether it's Senator Chris Coons or former Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist, both sides of the aisle, people have been in this business for a while and been worried about a pandemic coming and us not being prepared for it. And some believe this could be a foreshock of something that is much worse that's coming down the way. And I know you've been a part of a lot of these, given your experience with Ebola and other big challenges to the country. Are you angry that we didn't do more?
Of course I am. I mean, I think every American should be angry. I mean, look, President George W. Bush warned that something like this would come. President Obama gave a speech in December of 2014 where he said something like this would come. We in the Obama administration, after the Ebola response, set up a permanent office of pandemic preparedness and response in the National Security Council. We brought in a team to prepare for this. President Trump kept it the first year, but when John Bolton took over at the NSC, he wiped it out, sent the key members of the team over to other agencies. We left a pandemic playbook, 69 pages of what to do in the early days of a pandemic. The Trump administration ignored it. So the warnings were there. The bipartisan warnings were there. The bipartisan work had been done to lay the infrastructure to respond to this. Now, look, let's be clear. Even with all that, would COVID have been a difficult challenge for any administration? Of course it would have been. Of course it would have been. But by getting rid of the office that was prepared for it, by shutting down 38 of our 48 global monitoring spots to find something like this, by refusing to fill the position that the U.S. government had negotiated for inside the Chinese Disease Control Agency to get intelligence on this, by slathering praise on the Chinese government officials in the early days of this instead of asking hard questions, the Trump administration left this country much worse off than it had to be. That is why all over the world, this disease is being extinguished. And on the other hand, it's going to be one of the top 3 causes of death in America this month. So how could you not be angry about that?
You know, Jared Kushner, in a way, is sort of playing a role that you played in previous administrations, at least behind the scenes, coordinating, various aspects of this. So without necessarily, you can criticize him if you want, but if you were to advise him, if you were to watch this and say, hey, here's how you get it right. Here's how you begin moving towards something that gets the country in a healthier, more stable and secure position, what would be a roster of things that Jared Kushner should put in place?
Well, I think there are 2 things that have gone badly wrong here. The first is it's not clear who's in charge at the White House of this problem. After all, the president of the United States stood up and said that Mike Pence was in charge and was running the response. And in the meantime, Jared Kushner had his own task force. And we know from talking to senior government officials in the states that those 2 task forces kind of warred with one another and made this testing problem much worse. So while the Pence task force was busy trying to get state testing going, particularly in March and early April, the Kushner task force was working on private testing labs, and the test equipment and chemical manufacturers didn't know which system they were supposed to ship chemicals to. I talked to governors' offices all over the country who told me we can't get chemicals for our state testing labs because the Kushner task force has said to send them to the private testing lab. So the first thing you have to do is have clear lines of authority, clear lines of accountability. We haven't seen that. And the second thing, Steve, is you have to have confidence in the government employees, and the government experts. The hallmark of Kushner's work on all these problems has been to say, basically, he thinks everyone in the government is dumb, and that he wants to hire a bunch of people from outside consulting firms to kind of run circles around these people. And I have great respect for the people in the outside consulting firms, but I will tell you that some 28-year-old hired out of Boston Consulting Group or McKinsey cannot match the expertise of the career people in these agencies who've devoted their lives and their expertise to understanding how to manage these crises. And the consistent approach here has been to downplay, degrade, distrust that expertise, and instead fetishize the expertise of outside consultants and outside private consulting firms. And I think we have paid the price for that in this COVID response.
Ron, in our last minute or so, I'd love to get your take on the state of science and how we're going to evolve this. And some of that involves private firms. I interviewed Michelle McMurray-Heath, the brand new CEO of Bio. She's an African woman, African-American woman, a scientist. And she said the way we're going to get there, the first thing we have to do is just get beyond this border problem, that science happens globally. There are exchanges that are going right now. But if there's a time where borders are back and nations are beginning to not share as much as they used to, and there's clearly a divide between China and the United States. What does that do to the health of the science ecosystem as you look at it? And not only for now in dealing with SARS-CoV-2, but thinking about the next kind of pandemic or plague that may come our way.
Well, Steve, I think it's there's a simple example to think about in this regard. We are hopefully going to have a COVID vaccine soon-ish, probably later this year, and it'll probably take more than one vaccine to beat COVID. Maybe different populations will need different vaccines. And what we don't know is, will that vaccine be discovered and made in the U.S. or discovered and made someplace else? And even if this one is discovered and made in the U.S., the vaccine for the next big crisis may be discovered and made someplace else. We just don't know. Without global coordination on this, we're putting Americans at risk. I mean, if this vaccine is discovered and made in Europe, and our relationships with our European allies are frayed, we have ostensibly pulled out of the WHO or defunding the WHO. What kind of access will Americans have to those drugs, to those treatments, to those vaccines? And so this is a global challenge. We have global resources to fight it. We need to work with our partners, particularly in Europe, to develop the science, to develop the medicines, to develop the vaccines, to develop the distribution systems, so that we protect the American people. This isn't globalism for goodness' sake or for humanitarian sake, though humanitarianism is very important. It's globalism because it's in our interest to have access to the best medicines, the best vaccines from the best labs wherever they're found.
Well, Ron Klain, many people consider you a trusted advisor and counselor. Some people call you their Ebola czar. Today, you're our pandemic guy. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on these important issues of the day. I really, really appreciate your time. And I want to thank all of you for joining me today. We're going to look forward to seeing you tomorrow. I'm Steve Clemons. Be well.